Welcome to the logic lesson where we wire up the defaults form. Now let's jump right into our application. This is where we left off. Let's actually close these things out. And let's go over to our controls and open up our logic control. I'm sorry, our default control. So there's our default control, which has our hourly rate, pre-bill the client, yes or no, cut off the client, yes or no, the number to cut off at, the minimum hours, increment the billing, round up, and submit. So let's talk through the logic of what's going to happen. When we first open this form, we need to load the defaults. Okay, so we're going to have to immediately go out and get the defaults for this form. Now, this is a little bit different than most tables where we only want one record, because we're only going to store one record in the defaults table. So we'll have to deal with that logic. But then we're going to populate this form with whatever is in the table, if anything. And that's the other thing is the defaults table might be empty, in which case we need to not populate anything, or at least populate it with starter values. And then once the user fills everything out and they hit submit, we have to verify all these values. So for example, hourly rate can't be a text value. Neither can cutoff number, minimum hours, billing increment, or the roundup minutes. Okay, so we have to check to make sure those are valid numbers. And then we can need to update the database with these values. Okay, so let's take this one step at a time. Let's start with loading up the defaults. So let's pin this open and we'll go to our code behind. Now, if you were doing MVVM, you'd have a separate class for the code behind, but since we're not, we're using it almost like how we use WinForms. We're going to just do the code behind like we would in WinForms. So right here is where we need to do our work to load up that data, because this is the constructor. Now I'm going to create a separate method. Private. This will be a private void. And we'll say load defaults. Okay. Or yeah, load defaults from database. That's a little more clear, because normally load defaults would be like the defaults for the fields. So a number would be 0 and so on and so forth. But since this is the defaults control, this is the defaults for our application, I want to be very clear that these defaults come from the database. All right, so there's our method. What we need to do is we need to load the data from the database. So the first step is to have a list, actually a model to pass in. So let's create a model. Now we could put that model in this front end, but if we ever want to use this code again, we probably want it in our library. So let's say add new folder, and we'll call this models. Now I call a model, this is a pretty standard industry term, but a model is a class that's main job is to hold data. So let's create a model, and we'll call this the defaults model. And we'll hit add. We'll make this public. About the pre-bill, which is we'll call it an int, because I don't want to get stuck in the idea that we have a 2 and it blows things up. So let's call it an int, but we're going to either check to be 0 or not 0. That's the true or false value. And then again, has cutoff, so again, I could make that a Boolean, but I'm going to call an int, and then just again, if it's 0, it's false, otherwise it's true. And the cutoff, I could make this, I made it an int, an integer, so I'm going to keep it as that, so cutoff. Oops, I made that a lowercase o, and I've been making it an uppercase everywhere, so let's keep consistent. Prop, tab twice, and this one is minimum hours. Whoops. I'm looking at my notes and trying to type and trying to talk at the same time. Getting a little confusing sometimes. So minimum hours is a double because it can be like 1.5 hours, so 1.5. And then billing increments is a double. Billing increment. And then an int for round up after X minutes. And that M is capitalized. Okay, so there's my property list. There's only properties for the defaults model. So now I can make a call and load the defaults model. And as long as I type it and get the casing right, I hit Control dot and say add the using statement. Dot, this is the fun part, load data. And the type is defaults model, not control, defaults model. And so now notice that it's going to return a list of defaults model because I'm passing in a defaults model. I'll pass in my SQL statement, which for right now, let's call it SQL. And my parameters is, I don't really have a list of parameters. So therefore, I'm going to say a new dictionary object. I'm not going to change the default for the connection. Therefore, I'm going to use a standard one. So now I just need to create that string SQL. And now it's yelling at me because it returns a list and I want just one. But that's okay. I can say first. Okay, it's going to take the first one and put it in that list. The problem with the first is if there isn't a first, then we'll throw in an error. So I want, instead of a first, I want to say first or default. Now a default for any object is null. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So my SQL statement is pretty simple. It's going to give me the first or default for that. So now I have, at the end of this, I have a, let's just lazy the whole thing at once. I have a, hopefully, a populated model or a null model. And a null model is okay. The first time I use this, I'll have a null model because my database will be empty, which makes sense. You're not going to have a pre-populated data with your defaults right out of the gate. So if model is not equal to null, so I'm going to do a check here for a null model. And if it's not equal to null, That means there's something in the model. Then I want to populate my controls. Now, to do that, I want to know what all my controls are. Let's come back over here and keep looking. So let's start off with hourly rate text box. I'll actually copy that and say hourly rate text box dot text equals model dot hourly rate. ToString. And there we go. So there's the first entry populated. Next, we have our pre-bill client. And that's a checkbox. So dot checked. And we can say true, like so, and set the checked. Whoops, not checked. That's an event. We want is checked. And that's, that wasn't it either. Here we go. Is checked. Okay. You can tell by this is a property, see that little wrench? Whereas checked, you come back up here to checked, the little lightning bolt, that's an event. So that's how I could tell it was not right. Besides the fact that it's yelling at me. So is checked is if we mouse over it, it's a nullable bool. It means it can have null, it can have true, or it can have false. And it's got both a get and a set, meaning we can change it or we can read it. Now I can say equals true to check it, but that's not what I want. Instead, what I want to say is, and let's just kind of, here we're going to do, I'm going to comment this line out first. I'm going to say if model dot hourly rate is greater than 0, then do this. Okay, and I can say, I can put this value right there. Okay, and then I can do an else and put the value of false in there. Okay, so if the hourly rate is greater than 0, meaning it should be 1, then I set it to true. Otherwise, you set it to false. So that'll work. Now I could trim this down and say like this. Here, I'll comment this out because this is the more explicit way. Here is the more compact way of doing that. Model.hourly rate is greater than 0. What that's going to do, remember that this evaluates a true or false in the if statement. Okay? So this, if it's true, we set the is checked to true. If it's false, we set the is checked to false. Well, why do this whole if statement when we can take that value and put it right into is checked? That's all we're doing. So we're shortcutting all of this with just the one line. So that's a little bit of a shortcut there, but it's a pretty clear one. So now let's go back over to our default control and get has, we have a typo there. Has cutoff checkbox. Dot is checked equals model dot has cutoff greater than 0. Now we'll check that as well. Next we have the cutoff number. So cutoff text box dot text equals model dot cutoff dot toString. We have to do toString because this is an integer and integers don't convert automatically to text. We have to say toString, which then converts them to text or string. Okay, so that's the cutoff. And now the minimum hours worked, or minimum hours to bill. Dot text equals model dot minimum hour dot toString. And then we have the billing increment. So we say that dot text equals model dot billing increment toString. And then we have the round up after X minutes. dot text. Whoops. I hit my Alt key, I think. Dot text equals model dot round up after X minutes to string. There we go. So now there's all those boxes filled in. And that's only if the model is not equal to null. Now what we can do is we can either set the defaults for all these values in our XAML, or we can set them in code. I kind of like to put them in code because then I feel like I have a little more control in some ways. Maybe it's just me. So instead of doing the model, we're going to leave the hourly rate. We're going to set that to 0. And it's a number. In fact, we need to put it, we need to put it in quotes because it's actually a string. Pre-bill is checked. All of our checkboxes mean false. Actually, you know what? Let's set it to true because that's what the database says. The database pre-bill is true. And this is false. And the cutoff text is 0. The minimum hours to bill, let's start that off at 0.25. That's a quarter hour. And then the billing increments are also a quarter hour. And then the round up after X minutes, I'm going to start that off at 0. Just immediately round up to the next item. Okay? So now if we go over to our main window, go to the code behind for it, and to the about control, let's do the defaults control. That way we can see this in action right away. And let's hit start and see if we have any errors. It loads up right away. Nothing seems to have happened. And the reason why is because we have this really cool method that we never call. Let's go ahead and call it. This is why I try to run my code as soon as possible after I start typing, because debugging this little bit isn't too bad. Debugging a whole code behind, much more complex. So try and run it a bit at a time. Okay. It says system.dll not found exception, unable to load DLL SQLite.interop.dll. The specified module could not be found. Okay, let's view the details. Oh, they popped up my other window. At the SQLite connection, but I'm not positive. This is part of debugging, so I'm going to step into, or F11, and I'm going to look at this connection string, which says build time db.db, and it's version 3, and that's in the root directory. Okay, so that did work. It returned the data source. So now we take one more step and it says unable to load the SQLite interop.dll. Okay? Okay, so let's do some investigation. So we're having a SQLite issue and it's saying it can't load the interop. Let's first look at our references. So manage NuGet packages and look at what's installed. So one thought is maybe our .NET Framework version is an issue. That's one thought. It's not the best thought I have, but it's a possibility. Because it probably shouldn't add here if it didn't work. The other possibility is that on our build time app itself, it needs a dependency on SQLite. It shouldn't, but maybe it's not coming across. Now, see, I see SQLite, but I don't see a SQLite inner app DLL. SQLite. And let's just add just the core, because that's just what we really need. Let's just see if that makes any difference at all in how this runs. And it does. Okay, so that's pre-populated. Notice how it's saying we didn't find anything, therefore we're going to uncheck and check the certain ones. So that solved our problem. I'm not a big fan, but I think the issue here is that needed that interop on this side in WPF in order to figure out how the interop should work. That's my guess. SQLite on the UI side allowed us to get that. Again, not my favorite thing, but at the same time, it is what it is. So we have to do. But with the other thing it does, try it. And I'll also uninstall the EF6 and even the link. Let's just do just the core. And let's see, and also Entity Framework, let's uninstall that. Let's get rid of the things we don't think we need. And let's run it again and see if it causes any errors. And it hasn't so far. So you know what? I wasn't comfortable with all the stuff I was adding before. And now I've kind of proven that I don't necessarily need it. Now, if we come across later and we find it's a problem, we can always add it back. That's the beauty of NuGet packages. They're very easy to add and remove. All right, so we've proved that at least it doesn't crash when we try to access the database. We haven't really proven it's read the database yet because of the fact that we're getting a null check here. But that's because we don't have any records. So we can't really tell if it's reading the database and getting null or no records, or if it's not reading the database but somehow not crashing and thus returning just a null. So what we're going to do now is we're going to wire up, and let's close out the other ones. We're going to wire up the submit button. Okay? So let's create a event for the submit button. The way to do that is on the button, say click. Notice the little lightning bolt here. It's not in color, which is kind of a bummer, but this creates a click event. Now it says, hey, do you want to create a new event handler? And yes, I do. So I double click that and it says submit form underscore click, which sounds like a great name. So now over my code, I have a submit form underscore click. When that happens, we're going to save to the database. But first, we need to validate our database or validate our form. So let's do this. Let's create a private method right up here. Private bool validate form. And it's true. And the reason I set the true instead of false is because if anything comes up as invalid, I'll set this to false. That's a whole lot easier than saying if everything comes back true, then set it to true. So this is just a whole lot easier. I'll be able to do my validation and then return the output. So in here, let's start validating by looking at the hourly rate. If we can say equals false. So if the try parse says, no, it's not a valid double, then we can say output equals false. That's one way to validate all of our numbers. Now we have to do this for each of our numbers, and be either a double dot try parse or an int dot try parse. But that's going to be a lot of code. There might be a shorter way of doing this. Let's do a try. And I'm not even going to catch which exception it throws. Instead, I'm just going to say output equals false. So if you throw an exception, the output is false. Otherwise, you're good to go. So in here, I'll do double dot parse and say hourly rate text box dot text. Now, remember the difference between double dot parse and double dot try parse. Parse just says, yes, it's going to work, and it passes in the text, which should be a number. The problem is, if that text is not a number, it will crash and throw an exception, which will catch and set the output to false, meaning something didn't work. So that's a whole lot more simple compared to this. And the reason why is because we don't have to just do one here. We can put all of our parses in this same try. If any of them fail, we say, nope, that form's not valid. Now, this way down here allows us to be more granular and even tell the user, hey, this is what didn't work. But we don't really care. That's what it comes down to for me. So I'm going to be very, very simple and just say, yes, it works, or no, it doesn't work. So I'm going to get rid of this one. And now I'm going to do all of my parses in here. So the other thing was I was creating a new variable with the new value that had been parsed, but I really don't use that value. So therefore, do I really need to? I don't think I do. But now that I'm thinking about it, maybe it's going to be a good thing for me if I save these values into a model, into one of these defaults models. So what if I did that? What if I said defaults model, and then call it, let's just call it model, equals new defaults model. And then let's change output to is valid, because I'm not going to return a Boolean. I'm going to return a is valid and a defaults model. Okay, that's a tuple. So I'm returning two different things instead of just one value. So let's call it tuple, T-U-P-L-E. And that is introduced natively, I believe it's in 4.6.2 of the .NET framework. But before that, you can import or create add the NuGet package. I believe it's value tuples, I believe it is. And then you can use the same functionality. So now, instead of just is valid, we'll return that and the model. And we'll do the same. So down here, it's set to is valid as false. So even though we'll return a model, it won't be a valid model. Therefore, we're going to check to make sure it's not a valid model. And so we won't use it. Okay? So we'll do double dot parse. And we're going to say model dot hourly rate equals. Because we're already getting the value, you might as well save us a step of reconverting it later. So now the next thing we gotta do is grab the cutoff number. We'll grab all the things that break first. Actually, you know what? Yes, we'll grab all the things that break first. We'll actually put these two above it, just so we can actually have some good values that we might use, but the rest we'll kind of throw out. We probably won't use any of them, but just in case we do. So cutoff number, so cutoff text box. So we'll say model dot cutoff equals, and the cutoff is an int, so therefore we'll say int dot parse the text box dot text, and there we go. Next is the minimum hours. So model, if I can type today, model dot minimum hours, and that's a double, equals double dot parse like so. And then we have the billing increment text box. So model dot billing increment, and that billing increment is a double. Well, so int dot parse, and yes, these do matter, int versus double. If you were to parse this to a double, it wouldn't go into this value. So it's important you have the right values. And I said before, that's gonna put the values up here. So model dot has cutoff equals, I believe it's the has cutoff checkbox. Nope. Has cutoff checkbox dot is checked. And we need to convert that to an integer. Now, the way we're going to do this is an if statement, but this is a really shortened if statement. And this shortened if statement is question mark 1 colon 0. Now, normally this would work. The problem is this is nullable. And so it can be true, false, or null. But if we look at this control, let's go look at the checkbox. If we look at this and go to the properties, is checked, is false, is 3 state, is false. So 3 state would be true, false, or null. And we don't want that. So therefore, that's unchecked by default, therefore it can only be true or false. So even though it's a nullable Boolean, it's actually a Boolean. It only has 2 states. So we can make sure that we call it a bool. And now this will work. So what this is essentially a really short if statement. And it says this right here is a Boolean. So that's the if. And then it says that's the end of the if. And now the next section is the true section. The next section is the false section. So if this is true, then return this. If this is false, return this. So has cutoff will be 1 if it's checked. Has cutoff will be 0 if it's not checked. So therefore, we're done. Now, we can go over checkbox.isChecked $1:0. Same thing. And now we'll put either a 1 for true or a 0 for false. So now we populate our model, and if anything causes us a problem, we set the isValid to false. So now we can call this and say bool is valid. Let's call it, actually not bool, let's do var and say, let's call the name form. And I'm going to say form equals validate form. Okay? And I call it a var because it's actually a tuple. So it's going to be both the isValid and have the defaults model. So now I can say form.isValid, and there's my Boolean, or I can say form.model, and there's my defaults model. So and then return. That way, we exit out of this method and don't do anything else. Now, from here on out, the form must be valid. Therefore, we can start doing our save to the database. So let's create a new method called private void save to database, and pass in a defaults model, not the control, the model. Defaults model, and call it just model. So this is what's actually going to save to the database. So now we can say save to the database, and we're good to go. We need to pass in our model. So form.model. There we go. So now this submit form validates the form by calling a different method. Then it just checks to see if it's valid. If it is not valid, it says it's not valid. If it is valid, do this. Now it's a little confusing how it's written, so let's do this. Let's actually change this out a little bit and put this message down here and set this to true. And then we can put this code right up there, and now it's very clear what's happening. So now we have the form.isValid equals true, then save the database. Else, show a message and exit the method. Now I don't have to exit the method here because of the fact there's no more code. But just in case someone else comes along and puts more code, we can leave this in here. It doesn't hurt anything. I'll leave this without a return statement in case they do want to put code down here. And now it's very clear what's happening. Now, I don't have to put equals true. And this is up for debate. I prefer to see it because of the fact that a newer developer might stumble across this, especially if my naming's not great. Now, I kind of like the naming right now. Form is valid. That's really clear. So I wouldn't have a problem taking this off, except for the fact that then I'm tempted to do it everywhere. And it might not be clear every time. And so I'd rather be explicitly clear. Form is valid equals true. So it's valid. Then do this. Okay? This is very clear to read. It might not be clear always to read just this part. So that's why I always explicitly say this. My code is written so that hopefully the intern who doesn't have any experience in C# has just learned it from the classroom can come in and make modifications to my code without being lost. If you want to write code that's really complicated, that's your prerogative, but here's the deal. When it comes time for you to take a vacation at work, if no one else can modify your code, guess who gets called on vacation if there's an issue? You do. That's not something I want. Therefore, I try and make my code as clear as possible. So let's write the save to the database method. So I'm actually going to write two methods here. I could do an update statement. The problem with that is if there's no records already, then it won't update anything. So instead what I'll do is I'll do two things. The first thing I'll do is I'll delete every row from the defaults table. That way it's empty. And then I'll put one row in. So let's do this. Let's create our SQL statement. So string SQL equals delete from defaults. That's our SQL statement. And now we can create our call to the database, which is SQLite data access dot save data, the SQL statement we're going to pass in, and our new parameters. And that's it. Now, this would normally be a really bad thing because I'm deleting every row. Normally you have a where statement here, but we don't have a where statement because we want to delete every row. So just note that that is intentional, but it's a dangerous statement. So now you can write a new SQL statement. So SQL equals insert into defaults. And I specify which items to insert. The hourly rate, pre-bill, has cutoff, the cutoff, the minimum hours, the billing increment, and the round up after X minutes. And then we need our values. So this is going to actually wrap onto the second line. So we'll say and underscore, or actually and, but that should work. Use the underscore. I haven't done this in so long. Oh, that's VB, isn't it? There we go. Plus. It's one of those things you switch languages and you forget what the statements are. So there's our statement. And now we want to have our values to actually insert. So we essentially at in front of all of these. So actually you want to paste those in and then put the at symbol in front of all of them. And these are our parameters. So now we just need to create our dictionary with these parameters. So we say dictionary of type string object. Whoops. And that we're going to call that parameters equals new dictionary of string object. But instead of doing open and close paren to call the constructor, I'm going to do a open and close curly brace. And what that'll do is allow me to initialize this with some values. Let's put my semicolon at the end. And the first set of values, I'm going to put in also in curly braces. And I will say at hourly rate. And that will be the model.hourly rate. Okay, so that's my first value in the dictionary parameters. So now I can say comma and put my second value in. Now I need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 parameters. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Now they can't be the same. So let's make sure you copy and paste and overwrite all of these. with the correct values. And now this should be pre-bill has cutoff, minimum hours, convert them up here to integers. So we're good to go. So therefore, this model right now, this parameters dictionary has all of our parameters, which are going to get inserted here. Now you may say, why don't you just create a string builder and just insert these values directly instead of having these parameters? And the reason why is because of SQL injection. And what SQL injection is essentially where a user would pass in bad code in here and somehow, like for example, close out this query and then run a new query like drop table defaults. Now, that wouldn't happen in this particular case. So now we have the parameters and a SQL statement. We can do one more SQL call. So SQLite data access dot save data, pass in our SQL, which is now this statement right here, and pass in our parameters, which is called parameters, and we're done. That's it. So now we have this saved to the database. Let's see if it works. Let's run this. Wait for it to compile. There's nothing in there right now. Let's set our hourly rate. So I'll put mine in. Pre-bill the client, yes. Cut off the client. I'm going to say no to that. Cutoff number is 0. Minimum hours to bill is 0.25 is fine. Billing increment. Actually, you know what? Let's change this to 1 hour. Billing increment. Let's change this to 0.5. Let's just change some values so we have it. Round up after 0 minutes, I'm going to change it to 1 because that way if you have just 1 minute, no big deal. You get after 1 minute, we're billing you the half hour. The cutoff number, yes, let's say the cutoff is at 0. So, once you hit 0, then we've got a problem. So that's all set. We hit save and it says, oops, logic error. So let's look at our information. Our statement, I believe I know the issue. So let's look at the statement because it's hard to read here. I see. So that should say values. Sometimes it's easy to debug, sometimes it's hard to debug. Let's do this again. It didn't save, obviously. So now 350, we're going to cut the client off after 0 hours. Minimum hours is 1. And the billing increment is every half hour, round up to 1 after 1 minute. Submit. Nothing really happened. We'll probably have to put some kind of message in here that says, it was saved. But if we close this and load it back up, in theory, it does. It loads back up and says, here's the values. Now the minimum hours is interesting because that had a 1. The cutoff number what I believe was 0, but it looks like everything else was saved. So let's look at minimum hours and see why that didn't save. So minimum hours is right there. And I called it minimum hour, not minimum hours. So that was my bad in the database. I should have called it minimum hours. And instead, I think it says minimum hour. Let me look that up real quick. No, it does say minimum hours. So that's not the issue. I don't like the fact it says minimum hour there. Let's go to here and change that so it matches everywhere else. Hit Control Dot, rename it everywhere. In theory, that should have changed it. It did. So that wasn't the issue. Minimum hours. So why didn't it save? Well, let's go ahead and look back at here. Gonna put my breakpoint right after. Gonna load this up and say the minimum hours is going to be, oh, there it is. It's 1. That's interesting that it wasn't there before and now it is. I wonder if it's because I renamed that and I called it minimum hours somewhere instead of minimum hour. That might be it. That's a little weird. In theory, it's all working. Let's just verify it's all working by saying the minimum number of hours is 2 and the billing increment is, let's just say keep it at 0.5. The cutoff number, let's say that's actually negative 2. If they go 2 hours past what they've paid in pre-billed, then that's a problem. We hit submit. We close that down. We start it back up. It should be -2. It is. Minimum of 2 hours. It is. And billing increment still 0.5. So excellent. So we've got our defaults saving. So now we need to pretty up just a little bit and say when we submit, we need to tell them that yes, you've actually saved the database. So let's do that. Once we save, we should say messagebox.show. Let's just say success. Really simple. And now we won't change it. Start up again. We're good to go. Those are all changed. Let's change it to 0 and say don't cut off the client. Submit that. Close it out. Restart it. And it's supposed to do, it's really a simple form. I mean, it really is just load the data, save the data. Don't even have to worry about remembering which data we're saving. So as always, make sure you do this yourself. Make sure that you get the same things that I'm getting, that you fix those couple of bugs we came across, and that you understand why things are working the way they are before we move on, because we're going to do this over and over and over again for our other forms. All right. So that's it for the defaults form. Once you're done, then move on to the next lesson.